Guys, this is Beginning Scratch, Lesson 3. So a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So we're going to be learning about loops and variables, what they do, what we use them for, and we're going to work on a little rocket ship project that'll use kind of all the skills we've learned in these past 3 lessons. Okay, so before we get started, some quick review. Number 1, how many types of blocks are there? And number 2, what is the coordinate plane? You guys can pause and think about your answer. Okay, so number 1. There are 3 main types of blocks. So the action blocks, which allows to move things around, reporter blocks, which report back information, and conditionals. Basically, these are a comparison of 2 values, and it'll return a true or false value. Number 2, what is the coordinate plane? So the coordinate plane is a set of x-axis and y-axis, and the y-axis is up and down, and the x-axis is left and right. It's kind of a way of thinking about the location of our sprites. Alright, so now we're moving on to loops. So a loop is basically a way of repeating a set block of code. And basically there's 3 types, and these all differ because we can change the amount of times they repeat. So the first one just repeats whatever number we put in here. This one will repeat 10 times. The next one will repeat forever. So it'll never end until you stop the program. And the third one, it'll repeat until some action happens. So an example might be repeat until the user presses the spacebar, and then it'll just run the rest of the code. You might notice that this little notch here that's on the left and the right is not in the middle, and that's because since this code runs forever, you can't put anything after it because this block will never end. It'll never get to anything else. Alright, so now I want you to take a look at this block of code and see if you can figure out what it does. This includes stuff we've learned today and a few lessons ago. You guys can pause here and think about your answer. Okay, so this, it uses movement blocks. It goes to 28, 24, and then it points in direction 90. That just means to the right. And then it'll repeat this step 15 times, and the step is moving 10 steps. So really, if it's moving 10 steps 15 times, we can do some quick multiplication and get 10 times 15, which is 150. And once it's moved 150 steps, it's going to repeat this action until we press the space key. So until we press the space key, it's going to be just turning to the right. And then once we've pressed the space key, it's just going to always point towards the mouse pointer. So just forever or until we end the program. Okay, so before we move on to if statements and variables, I'm going to show us a quick example of what this is. So we can see it goes to the middle and then steps over here, and then it's going to spin to the right until I press the spacebar, and now it's pointing at my mouse. You can see it's just going to follow it, and this part runs forever or until I end the program. So now it's not running any of the code, so it doesn't follow my mouse. Okay, so now we're moving on to if statements and variables. So an if statement performs something if a conditional, remember a conditional has pointy sides and points to true or false. If it points to true, it'll run this. And then it'll run the code that comes after. If it doesn't, it'll just skip this code and then run whatever comes after here. An if-else statement is kind of similar, where it has a conditional here. If it points true, it'll run this code. But instead of running this code and then running whatever comes after, it'll only run one of these code blocks. So if it's true, it'll run this one and then skip the else to here. If it's false, it'll skip this block and run the else block. So if we have less than 50 cookies, maybe we're going to buy some frosting. But if we have more than 50 cookies, we're going to buy some sprinkles. So stuff like that. So a quick quiz on what you've learned so far. What does this code do? This is similar to our first example. We've learned most of this stuff today, but also some of this stuff yesterday or the lesson before. So you guys can pause and take a look at the question and think of your answer. Okay, so this goes to this coordinate, so x86, y13. It's going to point to the right and then have this forever loop. If we press the space key, it's going to move 10 steps. So every time we press the space key, it moves 10 steps. Otherwise, if we're not pressing the space key, it's going to turn 15 degrees. Okay, variables. Variables are kind of like a container that you can fit information in. They're called reporter blocks because they report back the information back to you. And these can contain things like numbers or words, and you can also change them in the program. So in the example, we can have our variable equal to 4, which would be a number, or tree, which is a string or word. So why do we use variables? This is because it makes things much more efficient, and in the example I'm about to show you, you'll see that one of the cars, even though it does the same thing, it uses a lot more code. So here we have some normal code. It basically goes to the start, and then moves 5 steps and waits, and moves 15 steps and waits, and moves 25 steps and waits. And we can see that it's going to move by a larger amount every time, but we have to write down this code over and over and change every individual number. And that's not a very efficient way to code, so we're going to go to convertible 1, and this actually is much more efficient. So when we press the up arrow, it's going to go to the starting location, set the speed to 10, and then repeat this code 20 times. So it's going to move whatever speed variable is equal to. So first it's going to be 10, and then increment that by 20. So then it's going to go by 30. It's going to wait, and then move by 30, and then increment to 50, and then wait, and then move by 50, and then increment to 70, and so on until it gets to the end. So we can see they're basically doing the same thing. They're just incrementing the amount of speed they go by, but this one is much more efficient. So if I do this, and then space and up arrow, we can see they both pretty much do the same thing. They're speeding up. But the blue car, we actually, not only is it more efficient, but we also get how fast it's going up here, because we can display the speed variable. Alright, so now that we know why we use variables, we can move on to our animal project. So now it's your turn. I want you to make an animal sprite and a food sprite. And after you make those two sprites, I want you to go to variables and then create new variable and have that variable represent how much food it's eaten. So like apple bites or muffin bites or uh, amount of food basically. And the end goal of this project is we want the food to be following your mouse. So wherever it goes, the food goes. And when you click, the animal, wherever it is going to come to the food or your mouse and eat the food. And we're going to increase the variable by 1 because it's eaten a piece of food. So you can pause and work on these 3 steps, and then we'll come back to the example. Alright, so for the food, it should have not that much code, but first we want it to be a little bit larger than the default sprite. So we're going to set that to 150%. And then it's going to go to a location just so it's not stuck at the edge every time you run a new program. And then forever, we just want it to go to the mouse pointer. Wherever it goes, the food should go. Okay, so once our code looks like that, we can move on to the next step, which is the animal. So first, we want to set this food bite variable to 0. Otherwise, if we, for example, eat 25 food the first time, the next time we run the code, it'll still be at 25. So it'll count every food the animal has ever eaten when we want it to be just how much food it's eaten in that program. So once we do that, you can pretty much ignore these purple costume blocks. That's just for the example, and if you don't feel like working on the costume, you can just skip that part. It's optional. And then it goes to this location. Again, that's just so it doesn't get stuck at the edges. And then it has this forever loop where if the mouse is down, it'll move to the watermelon and increment the bytes by 1. And then you can ignore this repeat 3 code because that's for the costume, unless you want to do it. So yeah, now, once it moves to that location, it'll basically just always be checking if the mouse is down and then move to the food if it is. Okay, now we'll just look at what that looks like. Okay, animal project. So now we can see the food is following my mouse, and we have Scratch Cat here, who is just sitting there, but if I click, it moves. And we can see we've incremented animal bytes by 1. And it'll just stay there until I click again. Now it's 2. If I click, yeah, and we can see, because we reset it, every time I press the start flag, it resets this number to 0. So now I can start counting again. Okay, so now if you want a little bit of an extra challenge, we have some steps you could do. You can add a maximum, so it'll only increment the amount if it's below the maximum, because maybe the animal's full after it eats 20 apples. And you could also work on the visuals, so you could add the costumes if you want, maybe even to the food, so that every time you eat the food, it changes to a different food. So maybe it goes from like an apple to a cake or something like that. Okay. So now we're going to be doing the rocket ship project. So this is kind of the base code you need. You want a variable that represents the countdown, and we want it to set it to 10. Now make sure it's set to 10 and not 0, because until now we've only had it set to 0, but we want it to go down from 10. So we'll start at 10, and then repeat this step 10 times, where we say what the current countdown is. So at the beginning it'd be 10, and then we're going to decrement or reduce that by 1. So we're changing it by -1, which is basically 10 minus 1. And then since we're repeating it, we'll say the countdown, which is now 9, and then change countdown by -1, so it'll be 8, and then say 8 until we get 1. And then it'll say blast off for 1.5 seconds, and then forever it'll just change y by 10. So it'll basically just go up, because remember the y-axis is up and down. So I'll let you guys pause, and then you can work on this part, and then I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so if it worked out correctly, it should look something like this. This is the example code we have, where if we press start, we have this countdown variable. It's counting down from 10, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then blast off, and then it flies away. Perfect. So now we have a quick review. So if you guys can answer these questions, you should be in good shape. And then if you have a little confusion, you might want to go back in the video to the part where we learned it. So number 1, what kinds of loops are there? Number 2, what's the difference between if statements and if-else statements? And number 3, why do we want to use variables? You guys can pause and come up with an answer. Okay, number 1. Loops. There are 3 main types of loops: the forever loop, the repeat X number of times loop, and the repeat until. Number 2. The difference between if statements and if-else statements will perform an action for one condition, and if-else statements can perform an action for 2 conditions. Basically, an if statement just checks if a condition is true and then runs a block if it is. But the if-else statement has 2 actions it can perform, but it'll only perform one of them based on if the condition is true or not. And number 3, why do we use variables? We use them because we can use them to make our code a lot more efficient. Okay, so that's the end of our lesson today. If you have a bit of confusion you want to clear up, you can go to our office hours that are hosted on Zoom on Tuesdays and Sundays.